This is a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station.
Hello and welcome to Beyond the Ballot Box. I'm Dashran Yohan. Last week, in light of the passing of Taib Mahmud, we discussed the legacy of Sarawakian strongman and how his policies shaped Sarawak over the years for better or worse. This week, we will be looking to the future and exploring how will Sarawak emerge from under the shadow of Taib Mahmud. Joining me once again is an expert in Sarawak politics, Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. This conversation will also be available as podcasts. You can look up Beyond the Ballot Box on the BFM app, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. James, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Hi, good to be back, my friend.
We did an entire episode on the legacy of Taib Mahmud last week and also how Sarawak transformed throughout his decades in charge. Before we talk about the present trajectory, just give me an encapsulation and overview. What key historical events or policies do you believe have shaped the state's political landscape the most over the years?
So I think if you look at the political landscape in Sarawak, I think it's quite clear that the landscape has been dominated by one family, Taib Mahmud and his uncle. Collectively, they were in charge in Sarawak basically from 1970 onwards until very recently. So we start off with the uncle Tun Rahman Yaakob, who was chief minister from 1970 to 81. And from 81 to 2014, it was the nephew, Tun Taib Mahmud, and after that he became the governor until very recently. So basically, we can make a very strong argument that for most of the time, Sarawak has been in the Malaysian Federation. Most of what you see today, the landscape has been shaped by this family. In terms of politics, basically at the start of Sarawak's independence through the Federation Malaysia 63. The politics was basically between three groups. This was the Dayak group, the Chinese group, and the Muslim group. But at that time, the Muslim group was quite divided. The Dayak was quite united. And interestingly enough, the main Chinese party, SUPP, at that time was also quite multiracial. But from the 70s onwards, the racial lines become a lot clearer. Sort of the Chinese sort of congregated from the late 1970s onwards, sort of congregated around SUPP. And then with the DAP coming in the mid-1970s, they also captured a portion of the Chinese vote. The Dayaks increasingly began to center around PBB, plus some key Dayak parties. And when we look at the last 10 years, the line is sort of fairly well divided. The Chinese, again, stick with mostly with SUPP and DAP. The Dayaks are splintered into three different parties. And the Malay Muslim vote or Malay Muslim stroke Melanau vote is all monopolized by PBB. So in terms of the big change, in terms of the political terrain, you can argue that the big change occur among the Dayak population. They've been sort of divided, put together for the last 30 years. And the Chinese has been relatively stable between the opposition DAP and the pro-establishment SUPP, while the Malay Muslim stroke Melanau, they've been solidly behind PBB. So that is basically the political landscape since independence.
So how did GE14 and GE15 change the balance of powers from a Sarawak point of view?
On the night Barisan Nasional lost power, Sarawak Barisan Nasional basically left the Barisan Nasional. And a short time afterward, they reformatted themselves and formed a new coalition called GPS.
Right.
So strictly speaking, they sort of didn't leave Barisan. They were not the only one. Several other parties also left after Barisan lost power in 2018. I think to understand the sort of dynamics between Putrajaya and Sarawak, I think you have to go back to a lot earlier. You got to go back to the GE in 2008. That was the sort of watershed moment in terms of Sabah and Sarawak politics versus Putrajaya. because in 2008, UMNO did not have enough votes or enough MPs to form the federal government. So for the very first time, they had to rely on the MPs from Sabah and Sarawak to form the federal government. So that's the reason why from 2008 onwards, the Dewan Rakyat Speaker and the two deputies came from Sabah and Sarawak for the very first time. And after that, shortly after that, 2009, I think, Malaysia Day became public holiday. So it was obvious that, Sabah and Sarawak suddenly found themselves with the power to rock UMNO's boat. So Najib had to play along. So that was where it started from. And of course, as you mentioned, in 2018, they lost power, and suddenly people realized that the so-called vote bank in Sabah and Sarawak were up for grabs. Because GPS suddenly became an independent coalition. In Sabah, it was Kelam Kabut all over the place. But again, there was enough block there. So the way to understand it is that from the Malay political establishment side, for the longest time before 2008, they saw the 57 seats from Sabah and Sarawak as basically Barisan Nasional's fixed deposit. And they said it openly, you see. So after 2008, after they lost, they realized that, there is a block of people from Borneo, and we can no longer take them for granted. And that's the reason why from 2008 onwards, both sides, on the Malay establishment and also on the opposition side, Pakatan Harapan, they started looking towards Sabah and Sarawak. And this can be easily proven because in 2018, when Barisan Nasional lost the election, one of the most interesting thing, and it's not widely reported, was that if you look at Pakatan Harapan, the so-called promises, the buku they put out, they had 5 trusts in the book, right? And one of the trusts was actually dealing with Sabah and Sarawak. I can guarantee you, I've been studying Malaysian elections for a very long time. If you go back to all the earlier manifesto, right, Sabah and Sarawak never came in as one of the core trusts of any manifesto before 2018. So this gives you an idea of suddenly people waking up and said that, oh my God, across the South China Sea, you have a block of MPs that account for 25% of the seats in Parliament. And therefore, on this side, on the Malayan side, if we want to form any government with the split in Malay vote, we need the 25% from the other side to help us form a government. So that is where everything sort of came together for Sabah and Sarawak. They suddenly found that, they hold the balance of power.
So they do hold the balance of power. They are kingmakers today, more so than they've ever been. So on the one hand, James, it seems like Sarawak has finally an even bigger say than they had before in politics. On the other hand, many might argue that this is the same right-wing elite political party and players that have been with Barisan Nasional in the past. They are just now taking a sort of different form. And this is not exactly a grassroots, pro-rakyat, left-leaning, social democratic type of coalition or socialist type of coalition, for example. It is essentially a top-down kind of warlord style of party, some coalition, some might say. How are you analyzing this situation?
So the first point to understanding what is happening in Sarawak is to basically understand the tagline for GPS. GPS tagline is Sarawak first, and that sort of summarizes up everything you need to know about GPS. Basically, they want Sarawak or Sarawak nationalism to be the cornerstone of their political ideology. And their ideology, for lack of a better word, is basically Sarawak for the Sarawakians. So that's basically where they come from. This step of Sarawak nationalism actually started in the 1960s. But under Rahman Yaakob, it was sort of pushed down, and it did not come back until after 2014, when Taib became the governor, and you had a new chief minister called Adinan Satem or Tottenham. He's the one who sort of brought it back, this rise of Sarawak nationalism. I think the reason why Sarawak nationalism has sort of suddenly come back was certainly, as I mentioned, after 2008, the people of Sabah and Sarawak suddenly realized that they hold a political balance. And for a very long time, there was this set of political grievances they held against Putrajaya, but they couldn't do anything about it before 2008 because they didn't have any power. So suddenly, for Sabah and Sarawak, they realized that state nationalism is actually a very, very powerful tool. And this also coincides with the fact that, for the last 30 years, many people in Sabah and Sarawak see increasing extremism in Malayan politics, and they didn't like it. When I talk about extremism in politics, what I basically mean is the rise of identity politics in Peninsular Malaysia. So it was quite clear that on the Peninsula side, racial politics, religious politics, all these things become much sharper. And I'm sure all your listeners know that in Sabah and Sarawak, the defining feature there is the demography, right? There are so many different groups. Race and religion, yes, is important, but it is not as sharp as in Peninsular Malaysia. So people became uncomfortable. So this coincided with the rise of state nationally, and it worked very well. So once Barisan Nasional fell, GPS was formed. So this tagline of Sarawak First is all about keeping the unique Sarawak identity, where the sort of Malaysia we had in the 1950s and 60s, where race and religion was not as sharp. People sort of let live with each other. And this is basically what the Sarawak GPS wants. They want Sarawak to be sort of a state within a state. They want to protect the unique Sarawak identity. And more importantly, they want to make sure that the sort of sharp race and religious politics we see on the Malayan side do not come into Sarawak. And I think this has sort of caught on with the people in Sarawak, partly because they can see all the crazy stuff happening in Peninsula, but more importantly, they have a clear point of reference because they see a political mess in Sabah after UMNO, MC, MIC enter Sabah politics after 1990. So there's a very clear, strong sense that among Sarawakians that we have to protect Sarawak, to make sure that the sort of toxic politics we find outside Sarawak, we make sure that they don't come in. So this is where the GPS has caught on, and I think they're quite successful in selling this message. And also, I think the people are also quite willing to accept this message that Sarawak is quite unique within the Federation of Malaysia, and we better protect Sarawak's identity.
So speaking about Sarawak's identity, autonomy and grievances with Peninsular Malaysia, I think we have to talk about MA63. Now, we have done full-fledged shows on MA63 across the station where we really dive deep into it. But for the purpose of this discussion, could you sum up what exactly is MA63 and how much of the MA63 promises have been fulfilled over either the last 4 years or since 2008, where you analyze that that's where Sarawak and perhaps East Malaysia at large started to gain more autonomy from Peninsula?
Okay, well, a bit of self-promotion. If you want to understand MA63, just Google my name in MA63 and one of my articles will pop up. Anyway, just a very quick summary for listeners, for those of you who find it difficult to follow MA63. I think the easiest way to understand MA63 is you see as historical grievances. This is not unique in Sabah or Sarawak. There are many places around the world that has historical grievances. The one which everyone in Malaysia have a clear understanding is that we all know about the Sulu issue, right? The Sulu issue is also historical grievances of the Muslim area in Mindanao against the government in Manila. So historical grievances is basically things that are deeply rooted in history that has been unresolved, mostly political issues. So in terms of MA63, without going into detail, I'll just say that the four main issues in terms of historical grievances for Sabah and Sarawak are the following. The first one is autonomy. I think people in Sabah and Sarawak are very angry with the history of federal intervention in state politics. Last week, I spoke about the Ningkan affair, where the federal government came in and helped to depose Ningkan. In Sabah, as you mentioned, Project IC and how they try to manipulate Sabah politics through the rotational chief ministers and all that sort of stuff. The second area is the issue of economic development, again, historical grievances. And this is linked to the fact that Sabah and Sarawak at one time produces 2/3 of the oil and gas output in Malaysia. And there's a very strong sense of historical grievances because many people in Sarawak and Sabah feel that, although we produce so much and yet our own states lack infrastructure, and Sabah, as you know, is the second poorest state in Malaysia, and Sarawak is also a very poor state, especially outside the urban centers. So people feel that the oil and gas resources has been taken over by Putrajaya. And of course, some of your listeners may know that one of the unusual things in Malaysia was that in 1974, they passed an act called Petronas Act. And under the act, it's quite unique. The act is unique in the sense that it says that any oil and gas resources found in any part of the federation belongs to the federal government through their company called Petronas. The second interesting thing about Petronas, which a lot of people do not know, is that the charter of Petronas says that Petronas actually doesn't report to the government. Petronas actually reports to the Prime Minister and nobody else. So this is quite unique. So people in Sabah and Sarawak say that you look at Peninsular Malaysia and you look at the major iconic projects like the Petronas Twin Tower, North-South Highway, KLIA Airport, Putrajaya, all these are mostly funded by oil and gas money from Sabah and Sarawak. So the third grievances is the issue of political recognition, right? I think in people in Sabah and Sarawak, they are very unhappy with the fact that, they always felt that, as I mentioned, the Malay political establishment, once Sabah and Sarawak helped to form the Federation of Malaysia, they sort of left as a fixed deposit. They will sort of ignore something like the country cousins, right? So they always were very unhappy after Sabah and Sarawak in the 1970s when there was a constitutional amendment where they lumped Sabah and Sarawak together with the 11 states in the Federation. Now, of course, that has been remedied 2 years ago when there was a constitutional amendment. Sabah and Sarawak are now placed on the separate line in addition to the other 11 states. So there was always this issue of recognition that Sabah and Sarawak are 2 out of the 3 founding members of the Federation.
Right.
So they're not 2 out of 13, right? It's 2 out of 3. Because originally there were 4 founding members, Malaya, Singapore, North Borneo, and Sarawak. But since Singapore left, you can't sort of lump those 2 together and say, Sabah and Sarawak are just 2 out of the 13. So in terms of political recognition. You also have the issue of, that the natives of Sabah and Sarawak, they were promised very clearly before 1963 that once Malaysia, the federation was formed, they will be put on the same level as the Bumiputra. In other words, the Bumiputra policy in Malaysia was supposed to apply to them. But they always felt like third-class Bumiputra. They always said that, the first and second-class Bumiputra are basically the Malay and the Muslim community in Peninsular Malaysia, where they received the bulk of the government subsidy under the affirmative action policies. And they got very little other than education. So it's a question of recognition. And the fourth one is something that I mentioned earlier. This need for Putrajaya to control Sabah and Sarawak by exporting its race and religious politics to Sabah and Sarawak. So this is sort of his key historical grievances when it comes to MA63. Now you ask the question, what has been happening to MA63? So basically what happened was that after 2008, when Najib realized that he needs Sabah and Sarawak, they set up the first committee, MA63. They did some work on it, like they set up different technical committees, but no real work was actually done until 2018. As I mentioned, MA63 was one of the 5 key pillars. So they set up a committee. They did try to deal with some of the core issues, and that committee unfortunately has never been able to resolve some of the core issues, right? So the core issues that throughout the last 10 years have never been resolved is that who actually owns the oil and gas resources in Sabah and Sarawak. As I mentioned earlier, one of the key grievances is that there's a level of underdevelopment in Sabah and Sarawak, and they feel that this is linked to the oil and gas resources. The second key issue that they've been able to resolve is that who actually owns the continental shelf, because there are lots of resources out there, right? So the sort of issues they've managed to resolve in the MA Technical Working Committee for the last 10 years are things like the Constitution Amendment. They managed to resolve some of the key bureaucratic roadblocks with Sabah and Sarawak. So now the next stage is basically they're talking about decentralization, and here we're talking about big items. They're talking about things like transferring healthcare back to Sabah and Sarawak. So the state level health department will look after the entire health of the entire state. And the other thing that Sarawak is very interested in, and my understanding that Sabah may not be very interested in this, is taking control of state education. This is a huge thing. I'm sure some of the listeners know that, if you look at the Malaysian budget, right, the biggest item is actually education. So education is really huge. So, transferring these two core functions, health and education, back to Sarawak is really a really big deal in the Malaysian Federation setup. It's not going to be easy, but I think there is a strong push in Sarawak, especially for education. And part of the reason is because the Sarawak government is very adamant that they're very strong in trying to bring back English language, because I think there's a clear understanding, not only in Sarawak, but throughout Malaysia, among the experts, that one of the reasons why Malaysia has become less competitive in the economic arena in the last 30 years is because the standard of our English is sort of dropping. But overall, the issue of education in Malaysia is dropping quite drastically. This is just common sense. You look around Klang Valley, right? If you were to ask me, right, what is the growth industry in Klang Valley, right? I always tell my friends, you look at the number of international schools mushrooming in Klang Valley. All these schools have the word international on it, but you look at the students there, they're all Malaysians, Malaysian middle class people trying to do the GCA, O levels, and A levels, right? They're really not international. They call themselves international because they want to bypass they want to offer the British or A levels. And Klang Valley is quite incredible. So we're not only talking about the expansion of private education, right? We're talking about a whole host of private providers. Klang Valley is one of the, in fact, I think it's one of the two places I know in the whole region, right? You have unlimited choice. There's even a Canadian high school qualification offered through Sadway. Then, as I mentioned, the British. Then you got American school in Ampang.
Right.
So the choice is endless. You got the Australian matriculation. I mean, people understand, but because of the sort of toxic politics that we see in Peninsular Malaysia, where education is highly politicized, right? Nobody wants to come out and say that we have to deal with this. I think the present government is worried about it. That's why there'll be more discussion about the PISA scores. But, the reason why I talk about it is that because I think people need to understand why the Sarawak government is moving towards its own way education, because there's really no time to waste. They really want to do this, and I'm highly supportive of what they're doing.
On the show with me today is Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. We will continue this discussion after the break. Keep it here on Beyond the Ballot Box, BFM 89.9. Welcome back to Beyond the Ballot Box. I'm Dashran Yohan, and on the show with me today is Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. And I'm asking him, how will Sarawak emerge from under the shadow of Taib Mahmud? This conversation will also be available as podcast. You can look up Beyond the Ballot Box on the BFM app, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. If you are listening to this on Spotify, do give us a follow, drop us a review. It would be really, really helpful. So James, how would you describe the similarities and differences between Taib Mahmud and Abang Jo?
I think in terms of the structure of GPS, not much has changed. The core of GPS is still PBB. Basically, the institutional structure of politics in Sarawak was carved out by Taib Mahmud. That thing is still there. But in terms of the sort of initiative that is going on in Sarawak, I think is quite different. I think the Premier Abang Jo is going all out to sort of lay the foundation for Sarawak for its next phase of economic development. So the sort of thing, as I said earlier, is sort of a state within a state approach. So they're sort of trying to do everything themselves rather than wait for the federal government. I think one of the reasons why they're able to do that is because Sarawak has a fairly large reserve. When he took power, they had a reserve of about 30 billion ringgit. This is cash in the bank. Plus, after the settlement with Petronas, they've been getting billions of ringgit additional money from Sarawak. So let me just run through some of the things they're doing. I'm just going through the list without saying whether I support or not. It's just a list. So, for example, they set up their own development bank, and they're in the process by next year buying a commercial bank. They're in the process of setting up their own airline. They set up their own oil and gas company called Petros. They're moving into things like hydrogen production, and they're trying to sell the electricity through new technology. When I say new technology, is that this technology does not exist yet, and here I'm talking about trying to build a special underground pipeline to sell electricity to Singapore, right? So things like that. And also they're also going very big into digital economy. And of course, the big thing everyone is talking about in Sarawak now is that how can Sarawak benefit from Nusantara, the new capital built in Indonesia. So many of them think that there'll be some sort of spillover effect. So these are some of the big things that are going forward. And of course, the big thing is something that's been around for quite long, which is the Sarawak Corridor for Renewable Energy Score. So that's been around for a long time. Basically, they want to make Sarawak a powerhouse in terms of cheap electricity because of the hydropower. But I think he has some big challenges coming up.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is because Sarawak, like other states, the economy actually contracted during the COVID years.
Right.
My own figures suggest Sarawak economy actually contracted by somewhere between 5 to 10%. And Sarawak's economy is quite small. They contribute only about 10% of Malaysia's GDP. That is one constraint. The second constraint is, as I mentioned, the HR issue. HR issue is high quality workforce, because for the last 30 years, people with highly skilled have been leaving Sarawak, moving to Klang Valley in Singapore and overseas. And of course, the other thing is a small population, less than 3 million people. But again, Abang Jo, I would argue, is highly ambitious. He's already put out a plan called the Post-COVID Development Strategy. And the idea is to make Sarawak a fully developed state by 2030. Whether we will arrive there in about 5 or 6 years' time is open to debate. But really, if you look at the time he's been premier, every year he comes out with a lot of new initiative. Some of it is untested technology like hydrogen production, but you really can't fault him for not thinking outside the box. A lot of stuff that he's doing, none of the other states are doing.
When we look at the challenges faced by Sarawak today and moving forward, how much of those challenges are because of Taib Mahmud himself? So, for example, credible environmental organizations such as the Bruno Manser Fonds have alleged that Taib has amassed billions through various businesses, especially logging, rainforest logging. Many organizations have also pointed out, while Sarawak saw some GDP growth during Taib Mahmud's time, at the same time, there was massive wealth and income disparity between the haves and the have-nots, the urban and the rural. How do you see these challenges, these legacy left behind by Taib Mahmud? How do you see Sarawak and Abang Jo and Sarawakians at large dealing with this moving forward?
So I think all those things are basically true. As I mentioned in our conversation last week, what you will see moving forward is that more and more of these stories will come out now that he's no longer around. So a lot of it previously was basically what we might call allegations. But now I suspect a lot of stories coming out will be based on facts. Part of it is because there is a litigation currently happening between Taib's children and the second wife. And with litigation in the courts, once the paper goes in, those papers sooner or later will be leaked out, and you will have the real details about the holdings, at least in Malaysia, where it can be double checked. I think all those things will come out, and I think that I'm one of the people who believe that a lot of the stories will probably be proven true. I think The only question mark is the sort of figures involved. I think that is the only question mark. People don't know the true figures. Because if you look at the allegations, it can be hovering anywhere between, at the lower end, people talk about 10 billion US dollars. At the higher end, people talk about 30 billion US dollars. That is a huge difference between 10 and 30 billion dollars. But again, all those things I believe will come out in the coming years. And I think we will just have to sit and wait rather than speculate. As to your question about income disparity, yes, the income disparity in Sarawak is very bad between the elites and the normal people, and especially between the different groups, and also between the urban areas and the rural areas. I think a lot of these things can't be resolved immediately, especially income inequality, because the trend in Sarawak is actually consistent with the trends in the whole of Malaysia. If you look at Malaysia, right, the trend now, the worrying trend now is that the intra-inequality between the three major ethnic groups, the Malay, the Chinese, and the Indians, between the richest Chinese and the poorest Chinese, the richest Malay and the poorest Malay, the gap are getting bigger and bigger. So in Sarawak, you find basically the same thing. So this is something where policymakers have to intervene to create a better playing field. The bottom line is not a Sarawak problem. It's actually a Malaysian problem, and that is Malaysian workers are very, very badly paid. Basically the owners or the capitalists are the one getting the bulk of whatever profits are made. And of course, the argument put forward is that the reasons why Malaysians are badly paid is because productivity is low. Part of that argument is true, but that sort of argument for me, right, is not the full part of the picture. The full part of the picture is actually that our education system is in a crisis. We're just not producing skilled workers. You can, there are people who say, oh, not true. University Malaya or USM, they rank very highly. Yes, that is all true, but it's also true. It is also true that we produce low quality graduates. Because if we produce good graduates, right, the marketplace will have some sort of self-correction. You will be willing to pay. So most people are shocked when I tell them that, a top honors graduate in engineering from University Malaya, living in Klang Valley, starting salary is between 3 to 4,000 ringgit.
It's absolutely ridiculous.
So I can imagine how difficult it is, right? So people in Malaysia are really, really underpaid. So unless the government do something about the wage policy and upskilling, this income inequality thing will not work. So it is part of the larger picture. So it is not uniquely Sarawak. But I think in the Sarawak's case, I think I mentioned this last week, because the Sarawak elite is so small, the wealth is concentrated so much in such a smaller group, right? I mean, the joke in Sarawak, my friends tell me, is that basically if you look at the big money in Sarawak, right, it's concentrated in about 30 different families. And you can tell who these families are. You just look at the stock exchange and you look at who are the key owners of these Sarawak-based companies, and you know exactly who I'm talking about.
So, with that in mind, the Bumiputra Economic Conference is coming up, James. And earlier you brought up a very interesting point that Sarawakians and even Sabahans, for the longest time, they have seen, they have been perceived as third-class Bumiputra. That's how they say they have been perceived, and I think there's a lot of truth in it. Because even when you look at conversations surrounding the Bumiputra Economic Conference, should it happen, should it not happen, what does it mean? It is all seen through a pro-Malay or anti-Malay type of discourse, type of lens, which in my opinion is very peninsula-centric, because a very core group of Bumiputras are Sarawakians, are Sabahans, are the Orang Asals from Sabah and Sarawakians. How important is this upcoming Bumiputra Economic Conference? Are Sarawakians keeping a close eye on it, hoping that it would be more inclusive than it's ever been before?
So I think for the non-Muslim Bumiputra grouping in Sarawak is mostly Dayak, in Sabah is the Kadazan Dusun, the KDM group. I think they're looking at this very, very carefully. My understanding is that they've been invited to take an active participation in this Congress, and they will be pushing very hard for specific NEP type programs, affirmative action program, specifically targeted at the Bumiputras of Sabah and Sarawak. They after basically wealth creation. As I mentioned, in terms of education opportunities, they've always had quite good education opportunities through the UITM network. UITM, they actually have 2 branches in Sabah, 1 in Labuan, and 2 branches in Sarawak as well. So they've always had that access. And of course, don't forget, there's also University Malaysia Sabah and University Malaysia Sarawak as well. So in terms of education access, I won't worry too much about it. Like I said, higher education is an issue of quality. But in terms of wealth creation, yes, I think they will be pushing very hard for wealth creation. For me, the problem with the Bumiputra Economic Congress is not so much the wealth creation part. Governments can intervene to create wealth. The problem is that who benefits from the wealth creation? Because if you look at government intervention through the NEP, right, the people who actually benefit from the affirmative action, the wealth creation portion of it, right, is actually the elite Malays or the Malays who are connected to UMNO. They are the main beneficiaries. So in terms of Sabah Sarawak, if you don't design the program properly, right, then it is the elites in the Dayak community, the elites in the KDN community who will benefit, and the ordinary Dayaks and KDN people will not benefit. So we're back to square one. That is one issue. The second big issue in terms of the Bumiputra Congress is that when they talk about intervention in the last 60 years in Malaysia, right, they talk about basically through government intervention, through wealth creation is via basically the GLC vehicle. That's number one. Secondly is through government, like they're setting up TERAS to buy shares in companies. So that's an equity thing, right? The bad news is that they've been doing this since 1971, since the new economic policy, and this thing has not worked. So I'm really hoping that Anwar Ibrahim will have, think out of the box about some other new policy stuff. Because if you think that you're going to do the same thing, expect a different outcome, the famous saying by Albert Einstein, you keep doing the same thing, hoping for a different outcome. I don't think it's going to work. I think the reality is that you need a real policy intervention right at the bottom from the get-go, and that the wealth distribution goes down rather than business opportunity for the elite Bumiputra companies from Sabah and Sarawak, because we know who owns them. And if the opportunity goes to that group again, then 10 years from now, you and I will be sitting down and talking about the same issues over and over again.
Absolutely. So, a hot topic I'd like to get your thoughts on, James. There's going to be a slew of redelineation exercises around the corner. Basically, constitutional process of drawing electoral boundaries or redrawing to ensure that the value of one's vote is equal, irrespective of our geographic and demographic breakdown or background. That's the principle of it, and it takes place once every 8 years. So Sarawak can begin redelineation exercises this year, Sabah in 2025, and Peninsular Malaysia in 2026. So this is the big question. Should East Malaysia receive 1/3 of the parliamentary seats available?
So a lot of people, especially some of my NGO friends, CSO friends in Kuala Lumpur circle, said that this is really unfair. We should really look at electoral system that is based on one person, one vote. Yes, that is true. But here we're talking about the issue of historical grievances and a set of guarantees that was negotiated at the time of independence. So you cannot apply today's standards and lens on something that happened in history. Because if you start doing that, right, then many of the issues that was done in history, you can come back and argue about it again. I'll give you a very extreme case, right? Because there are some extreme Malay groups out there saying that, that the so-called pendatang, the non-Malay, should have never been given citizenship, right? And that we should open up this discussion again. That was the deal done before Malaya became independent. Yes, it was negotiated by the British and the elites. that the quickest way out to form the federation and get independence was that the existing Chinese and Indian population at that time, almost all of them were born outside Malaya, right? Were given citizenship. So if you want to talk about history and you apply today's lens, then you really open up a can of worms. My stand is very clear on this issue. This is a part of these historical grievances packages. This was a sort of package that was formulated and agreed upon before the federation was established in '63. And as far as possible, we should not rock the boat. We should go along with it. Now, this may be so-called anti-democratic, but if you want to talk about democracy, there are lots of things that is not democratic in Malaysia. In fact, a very, very simple thing when you talk about democracy in Malaysia is that your ability to voice out concern or your ability to protest against the government. All this is highly regulated in Malaysia. For example, you have to be I'm not saying that you cannot say what you want, but you always have to be very conscious that in Malaysia, right, you can't say anything related to royalty, or you can't say anything related to Malay special rights. So you can say that that is a form of censorship. In terms of protecting against the government, you can't hold a protest because you need a police permit. So everything is tightly controlled. So to suggest that somehow this electoral thing doesn't apply to historical issues, I think this is the sort of a fake argument that we're seeing. My position is that if you want Sabah and Sarawak to be happy going forward, less turbulence in Malaysian politics, in some ways is actually a good thing to apply this break to Sabah and Sarawak, the 2/3, so that if anything were to go wrong, at least at the very minimum, if there's any major constitutional amendments, you have to consult the leaders in Sabah and Sarawak. And there's also one very important point that the CSO community in Peninsular Malaysia don't bring up. They talk about everything being equal, right? And that they said that this argument on constitutional amendment doesn't apply because Parliament is supreme. That is actually again not true, because anything to do with Malay special rights and Malay adab and Malay royalty, right? Parliament actually cannot pass it without the consent of the Conference of Rulers. So, the sort of argument they put forward about democracy, Parliament is supreme, one vote, one, all these things, right? There are all sorts of caveats in the Malaysian system. So I think a lot of people talk about this issue. Yes, say one person, one vote on it. It's a very, very simple argument. Everybody sort of said, oh, yes, yes, yes. But if you sort of dig a bit deeper, I think two issues come to mind is that, this is really grounded in history. You can apply today's lens. And secondly, a lot of things they say about is actually not true if you dig a bit deeper and look at it in more detail.
So 3 points to that I'd like to get your thoughts on. Number one, CSOs, at least the ones I've spoken to, aren't saying that right now we have one person, one vote, one value, and that if we give East Malaysia 1/3 of the seats in Parliament, it would violate that concept. What CSOs have said is that things are already bad right now. Things are already violating that concept, that principle. We are looking at terrible malapportionment, oversized constituencies, where a person in a constituency in Perlis may have 10 times the value of the vote as someone living in Bangi or Kota Raja or Damansara. And on top of that, Sabah Sarawak already right now have an overrepresentation of seats when compared to its population density. Second point, there are constitutional and electoral experts who argue that 1/3 seats in Parliament for Sabah Sarawak wasn't exactly stated in the MA 63 agreement. And third point is that many CSOs argue that Sabah Sarawak should instead push for a devolution of powers or devolving of powers via the Dewan Negara, which is the Senate. And that when it comes to the Dewan Rakyat, we must strive for the principle of one person, one vote, one value.
Yes, one of the proposals put up by the CSO is that they say you give more power to Sabah and Sarawak through the Dewan Negara, the
Yes.
Senate. But the problem is that in the Malaysian political system, right, power rests in the lower house, not in the upper house, because the upper house is not an appointed body. Therefore, it lacks political legitimacy. In terms of your talk about the discrepancy in Peninsular Malaysia, as I mentioned earlier, this is a false comparison because in Sabah and Sarawak we talk about a historical guarantee. So if you apply, like you said, today's lens, and you said that, there's already a discrepancy in Peninsular Malaysia, we have to even up the vote in Peninsular Malaysia, and therefore we have to do it for Sabah and Sarawak. My argument is that is a false comparison. Because this is for historical reasons. As I mentioned earlier, I can also dig up all sorts of historical things, in terms of the guarantees, and say that why don't you apply the historical things to today's plans as well? Things like citizenship, the one that I mentioned. So I think it's a false comparison. I think the reality is that the delineation exercise will be conducted in the both states this year and next year, and we're very likely to see the proposal put up by Sarawak that will be accepted. I think the way to understand this is that we want the Federation of Malaysia to be what was promised back in the 1960s. And the thing that was promised back in the 60s was that Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore will be given indirect veto power through the more than one-third of the seats. And don't forget, when they got rid of the Singapore seats, it was never redistributed to Sabah and Sarawak. So, you can already make the argument that, there was a mistake made then, in 65. So why don't you remedy the mistakes? I mean, if for example, if you want to apply this sort of a what-if scenario, you can say that, if the seats in 65 were redistributed to Sabah and Sarawak, where Sabah and Sarawak back from 65 almost at one-third, then today we won't even talk about this. Then maybe the trajectory of Malaysian politics will be very different. So false comparison. Yes, people are unhappy, but then if you look at history, there are all sorts of stuff that when you apply today's standards and lens, when you look back, right, it is not right.
Before we wrap this conversation up, final thoughts on the future of Sarawak. How will Sarawak emerge from under the shadows of Taib Mahmud?
So now that the Melanau elites are no longer in charge, the power has been handed to the Kuching Malay community. I think the sort of Sarawak that will emerge will be quite different. I think what you will find is that the Sarawak identity will become stronger and stronger in the coming years. And if all the especially the economic policy, putting by Abanjo is successful, then you probably find Sarawak the most progressive state in the coming years. And if that happens, I suspect a lot of people want to move to Sarawak.
So let's keep our fingers crossed on the growth and prosperity and development of Sarawak. James Chin, thank you so much for joining me today once again.
Thank you very much.
That was Dr. James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. This conversation is also available on the BFM app, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Dashran Yohan, and this has been Beyond the Ballot Box, BFM 89.9.
You have been listening to a podcast from BFM 89.9, the business station. For more stories of the same kind, download the BFM app.